Hunter, have you ever climbed a mountain?
Have I ever climbed a mountain? I've climbed on mountains.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, and I've climbed metaphorical mountains, figurative mountains, but I don't think that I've summited an actual mountain before. No.
Yeah, I actually haven't either. I've climbed Mount Tabor, which is a
Right. Well, I've also climbed Mount Tabor, but yeah.
And for people who aren't familiar with Portland, it's a city park that's more of a mound shape, not mountain shape. Very easy to get to the top too. But the other one, I think, at least for those of us here in the Pacific Northwest, that would be a little bit of an easier climb would be Mount St. Helens. So I've had a number of friends do that, and it's really more of just like a tough hike. You don't really need gear and everything, but you can sort of, I guess, summit it to whatever you would consider the peak now, I guess maybe the rim. But all that's to say is that today, Hunter, we're going to talk quite a lot about, mountain climbing and mountains, and more specifically, Mount Everest, the tallest mountain in the world.
Very well-known mountain.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I would say it's probably, one of the most well-known mountains, especially unless you have a mountain that's actively near you. Obviously, I think about and talk about Mount Hood far more than I talk about Mount Everest, but that's also because Mount Hood is 20 miles away from us here. And,
it's sometimes visible from the city. Yes.
Exactly. Very, very visible. So why are we talking about Mount Everest? Why did we choose this as an episode? Well, I would just start by saying, Mount Everest is geographically incredible for very many reasons. And it's not just incredible because it's the tallest mountain, although that is definitely a big aspect of it, but it's incredible for the fact that it is a single mountain, a really large mountain within a range of really large mountains. So that sort of starts talking about the Himalayan mountain range, which is, an incredible geographic feature on the planet just by itself, right? I mean, it's Mount Everest is very prominent, but it's also kind of one of many. And we'll talk a little about what some of those other many are in this episode. It's also home to some of the world's largest rivers and glaciers. So, if you live in India, for example, you're probably well aware of the river Ganges. And so that does have its headwaters that start in the Himalayas. It's a very holy river for Hinduism. But there's a number of rivers that also sort of course throughout sort of that South Asia area that start in the Himalayas and have nourished, now billions of people, but just by its water source, right? So that's a huge aspect of it. The mountain itself has also spurred an entire industry, however. So, as we're talking about Mount Everest, we're going to talk a lot about the geography of it, some of the historic routes. We're also going to pivot quite a bit into talking about one specific industry, which is the mountain climbing industry. And while it's, mountain climbing has its history that predates sort of people climbing Mount Everest serves as certainly a pinnacle of achievement within that sport. And it does drive the industry quite a bit. We're going to talk a lot about that today. And finally, I think just as everything that we usually end up talking about, the Mount Everest, including its very name, is sort of steeped in colonialism. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. So that's sort of the wide range of why we're talking about Mount Everest today.
There's a lot that we can get at by talking about this one mountain.
Exactly. Right. That's the fun of geography. So we got kind of a lot to cover. So let's sort of dive in. And we're going to start by talking more broadly about the Himalayan mountain range. So I know this is an episode technically about Mount Everest, but as we run through this, we have to talk about a lot of different aspects of it. And so one of those is just talk about sort of the grouping as a whole. So before we get into Mount Everest, let's sort of geographically sort of situate ourselves and sort of locate, where the Himalayas is, because not everybody might not know where that is. So the Himalayas is located in Asia, and it sort of spans 5 countries, and spans India, Nepal, Bhutan, China, and Pakistan. And sort of runs, if you're looking at a map of India, or if you have a vision of India in your head, listener, and you sort of see the top border of India, that is sort of running up against what we would call sort of the Himalayan foothills. It's not quite the mountain range yet, but it's almost there. And it's basically right about the point where the mountains really take off. And it's at that point that Nepal would be the sort of the country that is probably most closely associated with this mountain range specifically. Now, India does have a little bit of the mountain range itself over in its northwest sort of corner, some of its states up there, as well as Pakistan. And then there's, of course, China, which through the Tibetan Plateau sort of has a little bit of over on that end. And finally, Bhutan, one of the most interesting countries in the world to me, that I would love to visit someday, although that's a whole other thing, is also situated within the mountains.
Yeah, get in line for that. You have to apply, I believe, right?
You have to apply. Yeah, it's a very beautiful area, but it's also kind of. I'm gonna spin out here for just a quick second, but it's one of those countries that is not really secretive in the same way as like North Korea is, because people can visit, but it's just very reclusive intentionally. So they
Right.
They're not like hiding anything, but they also don't. They like what they do, and they sort of live there, and that's sort of all well and fine for them.
Yeah, they're trying
generally
to preserve natural environments and cultures, and so there's a really strong limitation on the number of people that can come in.
Yeah, totally. And so, just going back to the Himalayas, this range, if you're ever looking at a map, let's say you have one of those globes and you can sort of feel the indents from sort of the mountain ranges and stuff, you'll notice that the Himalayas is a pretty stark sort of outcrop of mountains as compared to basically everywhere else in the world.
Right.
And this is really due to the tectonic collision of the Indian plate and the Eurasian plate. And so if you go back way, way, way back in time, at one point, all the continents were sort of smushed together in this big, massive continent called Pangaea. And then they all sort of separated. And then at some point, India comes just, like a wrecking ball, smashes into that southern sort of part of the Eurasian plate and sort of combines to create a sort of full continent, right? And so this is just a theory, of course. We weren't back there, but this is sort of what the theory says, and that sort of, as the mountains were smashing into each other, as the plates were smashing into each other, sort of smushed together, and then those mountains sort of popped up. And I have a sort of little anecdote here, but if you want to try sort of what this might look like, to you, just take two pieces of cloth, lay them down on a table, and sort of eventually fold them into each other. And what you're going to see is those cloths sort of fold together and up. That's kind of the same basic concept of what happens when two plates crash into each other. And so this largely would create what we would call the Indian subcontinent today. It's not quite, but this is largely sort of that area and sort of why it gets its name. The Himalayas, they span about 1,500 miles or 2,400 kilometers if you're not from the U.S. in length. So that's quite a long ways. It's a very long mountain range, not quite as long as some others. For example, the Andes Mountains are quite a bit longer, and we'll talk a little bit about that mountain range in comparison to the Himalayas pretty soon here. But it's still quite long. And the range separates the lowlands of India from the highlands of Tibet. And so, again, if you're looking at one of those globes and you sort of see the range, you can see sort of the topography. There should be a visible increase in sort of where the Tibetan highlands are compared to where, the state of Uttar Pradesh in India is, for example. And so there's actually a really interesting weather map that recently, just this summer, shows some of the dramatic impacts that the Himalayas have on the region in terms of weather, where the area in the south, sort of the Indian side, the temperatures were hovering around 40 to 45 degrees Celsius, or about 105 degrees plus Fahrenheit. And then on the other side of the Himalayan mountain range, inside the Tibetan Plateau, the temperatures were about 10 to 12 degrees Celsius, which would be around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So a dramatic increase or decrease in temperature, depending on which way you're going, over a relatively short period of time. And there's, of course, a whole lot of physical geography and climatology that goes to explain that I'm not going to get into here because I am not a climatologist. But I think it's just to give sort of the weight of what these mountains are and sort of the impact they have. That's a pretty fun one to show. And I've shown that map to people before, and they like it. And of course, within the Himalayas, since we're going to start talking a little about some of the actual mountains, or sort of mountain peaks, I should say. But so within the Himalayas, are some of the most prominent mountain peaks in the world. And this would include Mount Everest, the, titular subject of today's episode. But also K2, which is, I think, oftentimes debated as whether that one's actually taller than Mount Everest or not. We're not going to get into that debate here, but I definitely read that before. There's also a couple other really prominent mountains, and I did try my pronunciation here, and I might still get it wrong, but there's Kangchenjunga, and then Annapurna. And so those would be two other very prominent mountains for a lot of different reasons, culturally, in terms of religion, spiritually, but also in terms of prominence, in terms of how tall it is. So this, all told, the Himalayan mountains houses 9 of the 10 highest peaks in the world by some definitions.
9 of the 10 tallest peaks in the world.
9 of the 10, yeah. And I believe the 10th, because they were pretty close, and I don't have it right in front of me, but I believe that one of the 10s that's not in the Himalayas is Denali in Alaska.
Okay.
I could be wrong about that. There was 2 mountains that were really close, and I can't remember if it was Denali or not. But and the other mountain I hadn't really heard of. I think it might have been pretty far away from everything else. But anyways, by some definitions, 9 of the 10. Spoiler alert, or not spoiler alert, I should say, but maybe just a regular alert. If you want to sort of listen to maybe what some of these other definitions are, come back for a bonus episode later this week where we talk about some of these definitions and how these things get, maybe determined as what's tallest or not tallest.
Whenever we research something, it seems like it would be an easy task to find out the most something, the longest something, the tallest something, the highest population, this, that, and the other thing. It's never as easy as it seems, because there's lots of different ways to determine these kinds of things, even height, as we'll find out as you tune into the bonus episode. So what seems like an easy research task sometimes ends up being a little bit more complicated.
Well, I'm remembering our skyscrapers episode, which, definitely go back and listen to that if you haven't. But, those were man-made, buildings. People-made, which with very defined heights. But even then there was debates based on various characteristics of the building.
Right, you count to the antenna on top. Is it the top spire? Is it the top inhabitable floor? And so depending on what you count matters, because it would give that distinction to oftentimes to a different skyscraper if you used a different criteria for measuring it.
Exactly. And so there's almost a similar sort of parallel here, although it's a little bit different, but similar sort of idea of like sort of depending on how you're measuring things and sort of what's included and what's not included. And again, come back for the bonus episode because that'll be a fun one to sort of explore. But while the mountain peaks are probably the most obvious feature of the Himalayas, arguably I would say it's deep river valleys and rivers such as the Indus, the Brahmaputra, and the Ganges that crisscross the region and originate within the mountain range that are I would say far more important for humanity and sort of life itself, because these are huge rivers. These are really prominent rivers within the that start in the Himalayas and then course throughout sort of a lot of the South Asian area.
Super important for, among other things, agriculture, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so, I would say, because of these rivers, we get the rise of one of the most prominent ancient civilizations, which is the Indus Valley civilization. And if you're not aware, listener, the Indus Valley civilization started somewhere around, I want to say 2900 BCE, and it ran until about 1700 BCE. And that's sort of when it dissipated. And there's a whole long reason for that. I actually have a YouTube episode up to this week. I guess this would have been a few weeks ago at this point when this comes out. Right. Tells a little bit more about this history. But that was one of the first really prominent civilizations that was able to harness agriculture to then create these, pretty sizable urban sort of cities, which even by today's standards were sort of planned and laid out very impressively. So without these rivers, this kind of stuff, simply doesn't happen. And in fact, we actually see that the Indus Valley civilization, one of the theories for why it sort of goes away is because of some changes in the climate that affected some of the rivers that were coursing through the area. And sort of, once that happens, then obviously, people have trouble surviving there.
So if you want civilization, you want cities, you want agriculture, you have to have bodies of water. And so, as you mentioned, this is one of the cradles of civilization on the planet, really.
Yeah. Well, so Uttar Pradesh, which is a state in northern India, sort of runs right up against the Himalayas. That's home to the Ganges. Sort of runs right through Uttar Pradesh. Ganges is one of the world's largest rivers. It's also a very holy river, as I already stated. And Uttar Pradesh is home to more than 220 million people, a single state, right? So the United States, for example, if you're listening from the United States, we're about 331 million people across 50 states and 6 different territories. This is a single state that's relatively small. It's much smaller than the United States as a whole. Has 220 million people, and so largely fed, all the agriculture through the region largely fed by the Ganges and its tributaries. I think one of its major tributaries is the Sutlej River. So again, just very prominent. And these rivers are not just historically, important for ancient civilizations, but are also maintaining sort of current levels of population and civilization today. And then, so we've talked a little bit about rivers, we've talked about the mountains themselves, but I think it's also worth calling out that the Himalayas are also an incredibly important part of biodiversity. And so, obviously the Himalayas, very different sort of climates as some other areas of the world, such as the Amazon, which is, has a lot of biodiversity, the most biodiversity probably anywhere else on the planet. And that is probably a future episode someday where we talk about the Amazon.
Absolutely, it should be.
But I think it's worth pointing out that, while mountain ranges might not seem very hospitable, they seem very cold, they're very high up, they're very barren at a certain point once you get above the tree line. They are still very important for a wide range of flora and fauna. So this would include something like the snow leopard, which I know everybody really loves to see, on those nature documentaries such as Planet Earth. Very beautiful cat
Check out
species.
our episode on cats if you want to. I think there's a nod to the snow leopard.
Yeah, there is. There's also the Himalayan tar and the blue sheep. These would be both hoofed animals. And so, and then some of the other sort of flora that are involved, sort of the grasslands, the deciduous forest, the rhododendron shrubs. These are all very important to the natural ecosystem created by this high altitude. And not just the high altitude, but the difference between the lowlands and the highlands really plays into all of this. So there's
a lot of distinct ecosystems within a mountain range, right? Because these altitudes are conducive to certain types of plants and animals. And so if you have the largest mountain, one of the largest mountain ranges and in the highest mountain range, you're going to find a lot of diversity of things living in these different altitudes.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the reason why I wanted to call that out is because, again, I think people have maybe a penchant for looking at a specific area of the world, such as, even something like a desert, and thinking, well, it's all dry and nothing lives there. And it's, therefore it has less value than someplace like maybe a forest would. And it's like, well, there actually is a lot that happens there, even up on these very high peaks of the Himalayas. There's actually a lot of really important stuff going on up there. So as we sort of round out our sort of first part of this episode before we hit the ad break, I kind of wanted to maybe do a quick comparison with some other mountain ranges, because we talked a lot about the Himalayas. But obviously a lot of our listeners, because I have all these wonderful statistics, I know you're not all located right near the Himalayas. And so it's probably not as immediately visible inside of your head as maybe some others. And so I thought it might be fun to talk just a bit about some of these other sort of really large mountain ranges around the world to serve as sort of a comparison. And so the first I kind of wanted to talk about was the Andes mountain range. Hunter, where's that?
That is in South America. flown over part of it, very dramatic, and a very long mountain range.
It is. It's the longest mountain range in the world. So it runs all the way from basically the I guess not really a tip at the north, but basically Colombia in the north. Sort of snakes along that west coast all the way down through Chile, and then basically then down to the tip of Patagonia in South America. And it was formed from the subduction of the Nazca Plate beneath the South America Plate. And so if you're curious about subduction zone earthquakes, that we have a really good episode on the Cascadia subduction zone.
Right.
This is a very similar sort of plate tectonic system. And as such, places like Chile often get pretty devastating earthquakes as a result, because again, it's that same sort of movement. And that's how this mountain range was formed in such a dramatic fashion, so close to the coast.
And subduction is when one plate rides over another. Mm-hmm. And that is a situation that is ripe for earthquakes. Right.
Yeah. As opposed to sort of them rubbing up against each other. Yeah. It's one where it will slip underneath and will cause, at that point, it'll cause very dramatic, earthquakes, and it could also cause very dramatic changes to sort of mountains and that kind of stuff. So, that said, it is longer, but it is generally narrower than the Himalayas. So it's not actually, the Himalayas they can be, for lack of a better word, little, quite fat in a lot of ways. And the Andes is pretty thin all the way down. Let's move up to North America, maybe, and we'll talk a little about a prominent mountain range here, and that is the Rocky Mountains. Mm-hmm. And so that's a mountain range that spans really from sort of the western central Canadian area, sort of edge of British Columbia, all the way down through, obviously down to Colorado. I want to say it also hits New Mexico, although I'm not quite sure where the designation ends, because mountain range borders can be a little less defined. But it's still an incredibly large mountain range that's very well known here for places such as Pikes Peak in Colorado. There's also Glacier National Park up in Montana. And I believe Banff National Park is also part of the Rockies. And very beautiful, picturesque areas. However, they're an older mountain range than the Himalayas. And so this age and the erosion that's come with time has ultimately made them quite a bit shorter than their Himalayan counterparts. So maybe at one point the Rockies were taller, but today they are definitely shorter. That said, I think anybody who's flown over them or who has visited the Rockies can attest to the fact that, boy, it is still a pretty dramatic mountain range.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and obviously the Rockies, very prominent for skiing, all this kind of stuff. Very well known, but very well known in that regard.
For people in the United States, more familiar with the kind of industries that are associated with mountains through the Rockies, right?
Because exactly. Yep.
There's ski towns. There are a lot of hiking that goes on, through hiking, day hiking. And so, think about how that plays out in different parts of the world and how mountains create industry, basically. And as people travel around the earth more than ever, right? There's a big tourism industry associated with that, which we'll eventually circle back to when we talk about Everest.
Totally. And I think, as we're on this note, it's worth calling out that the Rockies sort of spawned, the Pikes Peak gold rush. That's where the gold was found for Colorado, which really got, places such as Denver and Colorado Springs, Denver in particular being sort of a fairly large metropolitan area, sort of got its start. It's sort of, why so many people moved there in the first place. So very prominent in terms of the history of how places came to be inside the United States. And then just really quick, because we're kind of running out of time here and I want to get to our ad break, but just to call out the Alps in Europe is another very prominent mountain range, sort of spans from sort of France inside the west, maybe even to Spain a little bit, and then over through Italy and then sort of over into Eastern Europe. And it was formed by the collision of the African and Eurasian tectonic plates. again, I don't want to spend too much time here, but it's a very prominent mountain range within Europe as a whole, and particularly ties into a lot of different European culture and history, obviously, but also a lot of different myths, through various religions, such as the Greek religions, the Roman religions, and some of the Celtic religions and Germanic religions as well. And so with that, let's go ahead and jump to a quick ad break because I've said so dang much already.
Please stay tuned. We'll be right back.
And we are back. So very quick correction. We learned this on our ad break here, that the Alps does not go into Spain. I must have been thinking of a different mountain range.
The Pyrenees, maybe,
the
right?
Pyrenees. There you go. Yeah. I kind of, as I was saying, I kind of like, actually, I don't think it swoops down into the Iberian Peninsula, but that's okay. We get some things wrong every now and then. We just make corrections as we find them.
That's how we handle it.
Yeah. So we talked a lot about the Himalayas. We've talked a lot about sort of maybe some of the history, sort of why they're so prominent, all of that kind of stuff. I think it's at this point that our episode kind of pivots to maybe something quite a bit different, but it's sort of mountain climbing as sort of a hobby, a global hobby. And the reason why this episode sort of fleshed out this way, where we're talking about the Himalayas and all this sort of physical geography in the first section, and now mountain climbing in sort of the second section, is because Mount Everest kind of epitomizes sort of both of these, right? And we're going to talk about that in sort of our final section as well, sort of bring it all together.
Right. It's almost notorious, right, for attracting
very notorious
climbers, and not always climbers who are particularly well suited to such a challenge. But this is foreshadowing.
Exactly. No, absolutely. Yeah. So let's take it back a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about maybe some of the history around sort of climbing tourism. We can't track the actual history of climbing all that far, relatively, right? So a lot of times our history sections, go back to ancient history. There might have been some aspect of this, but we don't know for sure. We do know, for example, that places like Mount Kilimanjaro and sort of Africa, and Mount Fuji in Asia are very prominent mountains, and had a lot of spiritual, cultural ties that probably did lead to people climbing them. Now, it's debatable on whether that would be even considered a hobby, and sort of, what they were doing, how they fared, all that kind of stuff. Is this a
pilgrimage? What is this?
Exactly, right. For example, we know that ancient Greeks climbed Mount Olympus, believing it to be sort of the where the gods lived, right? It's a very sort of famous part of Greek mythology. But again, that, it's debatable on whether that's a hobby, and we just don't have a whole lot of records for how well that went. And certainly, as we're talking about sort of the modern day idea of what it means to climb Mount Everest, for example, this sort of is a little bit different. These aren't quite the same thing. So it's something to note that people were probably climbing mountains for a long time, but we're talking about sort of mountain climbing as a hobby and how it spreads globally. In the modern post-industrial era.
Kind
of. Well, we're actually going to start, a little bit. Maybe we'll start talking about a little bit in sort of the Renaissance era.
Okay.
That's sort of when the idea, the romanticization of mountains, and it becoming sort of an idea that's sort of outside of religion specifically, and outside of sort of pilgrimage, sort of becomes sort of an idea. So the Renaissance, starting around sort of 1300s, 1400s, even into the 1500s. The Alps specifically, a lot of Renaissance artists from Italy, for example, the Alps would become a sort of focal point for these artists as they start to paint the mountains, and they start to idealize sort of what it means and sort of the beauty of them. And that sort of would kick off eventually people wanting to climb them, because, if you think about artists back in the Renaissance era, you can sort of have an analogous to it being, a sort of pop culture moment, right? Paintings are coming out, they're showing these things. And that becomes popular because these paintings are now popular and people want to visit them themselves. And so we start to see that happening. But it's really the Romantic movement in the 18th century, 1700s, that would really spark the sort of what I would almost term as sort of the mass interest in starting to actually climb mountains. And of course, there's what's called the golden age of alpinism. So it's sort of starting in sort of the 1800s, where many major peaks, including Matterhorn, were climbed for the very first time, as per our records that we can track. Again, just going back to our ancient history, we don't know if they were ever climbed or not. They could have been. We just don't have any records of that, at least as far as I could find. And sort of during this time that when the Matterhorn were climbed, that we also start seeing the rise of mountaineering clubs. And so one of the most famous was this one called the Alpine Club in London. It was founded in 1857, and true to its name, it's a bunch of people who are English people generally who are part of this Alpine Club, who would then take treks over to the Alps to try and climb mountains with some very rudimentary gear, if you can imagine. And so speaking of gear, as we're talking about sort of this mountain climbing industry, this is also the time when we start to see the technology involved in climbing really start to mature. And so in the late 1900s, late 19th century and into the early 20th century, there was a lot of sort of innovation of this gear, making the sport safer and a little bit more accessible. And so this would include the introduction of crampons. These would be sort of that footwear that allows you to really cramp into the mountain. Ice axes, and then rope techniques that allowed yourself to sort of tie, what's the word I'm looking for? Not hammer in sort of a stake, tie up your rope, and that way
so
you
can
have
be
safety.
Tethered to the mountain instead of completely doing it freely without any kind of security.
Right. Because, otherwise you take one fall step and you're gone.
That's right.
Yeah,
which probably happened a lot in history, and we don't always know that happened because people aren't there to talk about it after they've plummeted. So
exactly. But
yeah, and I mean this whole endeavor, right, to climb mountains and stuff. I mean, there's something kind of affluent and colonial about
absolutely.
it, almost, right?
100%.
To be able to have the resources to do something like that says a lot about one's position in society, and that probably tied into some of the motivation for doing some of this stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, it's definitely born out of affluence, right? If we go back to sort of maybe the cultural pilgrimages that are attached to it, during this whole time, this is probably still happening. There's not records of it, but there are probably, for example, Tibetan monks making pilgrimages into the Himalayas. I don't think anybody would be surprised to find that out, or some other sort of pilgrims, happening at various mountain ranges all across the world, whether it's Native Americans, pre-colonization in the Americas, or indigenous peoples in wherever, right? This is all happening, but this idea of the hobby is definitely steeped within sort of the colonialism and the affluence of Europe at the time as it's building its wealth. Because just being able to take a trek and sort of try and get your need to climb this mountain is such a privilege, right? That most places in the world at this point do not have.
Right. And then it also goes along with naming these peaks, right? And naming these areas,
yes,
the toponyms, the place names, and you put that on a European map, and it has a lot of staying power, right? Because that's what gets recorded.
Exactly. Right. I mean, and we're going to talk a little bit about Mount Everest's name specifically in our next section. So I don't want to dive into it now, but to use a local example here, in Portland, we have our nearest mountain is called Mount Hood. Now there's some debate of what the original indigenous naming was, but a popular one would be one it's called Y East.
Yep. And as you suggested, there's debate.
There's debate. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm not here to make a claim for any of them. But Mount Hood is is the name of it was a British admiral or a British lieutenant admiral or something like that, who just sort of adopted the mountain was just sort of named after him. I guess maybe he did some explorations up here, maybe along the coast or something like that. And now it's, hundreds of years later, and the mountain, is still on maps. If you go to Google Maps or Apple Maps, for example, it'll be termed as Mount Hood. The other big one would be Mount McKinley up in Alaska, that has since been renamed back to just Denali. And Mount McKinley was named for a governor in Ohio who had never visited Alaska. And so,
right, classic. The
place names are an interesting way of sort of colonialism's impact on regions well far in hundreds, thousands of years into the future. It's very interesting. But let's go back to sort of mountain climbing. Let's talk a little bit more about the Himalayas a little bit. So we've talked a little bit about the Alps and sort of the Alpine Club. But starting in the 20th century, Western expeditions really started to target the Himalayas as sort of the next frontier for mountain climbing, because it was such a stark mountain range, so physically dominating. And this would include the very first sort of attempts to climb Mount Everest. Mount Everest at the time was thought of as the tallest mountain in the world. Still is in a lot of cases. Again, come back to our bonus episode to figure out what that might mean. But then in 1953, the mountain was officially summited for the first time by a man from Britain, from England, by the name of Sir Edmund Hillary, and then his assistant, the person who went with him, which was a Nepali named Tenzing Norgay, and he is a Sherpa. And we're going to talk a little bit about Sherpa and sort of Sherpa culture in a little bit, but I just want to call that out that he is sort of of that culture as well. And so they successfully
and whether this is truly the first two people to climb the mountain is,
exactly.
This is what gets recorded. And so that's what we're talking about here. But that's kind of how history is played out, is, those who with power get to tell their histories, and those are the histories that get repeated. Exactly.
Yep. And so this recorded ascent in 1953 really brought sort of global attention to high altitude climbing and climbing Mount Everest specifically. Now, Hunter, I'm sure you're aware a little bit of some of the challenges of climbing Mount Everest, but one of the big ones is the lack of oxygen.
Right. I mean, it's even referred to as the death zone, I believe, because it's an altitude that people aren't really meant to inhabit, because most humans can't really inhabit that area.
Right. Yeah. There's simply not enough oxygen in the air at that point. And so, if you were to climb Mount Everest today, which a lot of people do now, we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like as well in the next section. But if you were to climb it today, at a certain point, you have an oxygen tank, sort of a similar if you were to go diving.
Supplemental oxygen. Yeah.
And so, it's kind of impressive. In 1953, they might have had some rudimentary versions of this, but it's not the same technology, obviously.
Right.
And so just thinking about how hard that must have been, either 1953 or any of the people who might have done it previously as maybe a sort of a pilgrimage, like it's just very impressive that anybody was able to do that with technology that didn't exist at the time. Let's just keep moving on, because, these sections just fly by and I have quite a bit more notes here. So, by the late 20th century, sort of the heading into the late 1900s, commercial expeditions really started to become more popular. And so companies started begin offering guided trips to the world's highest peaks. And this is sort of when we start to see the rise in global tourism to Mount Everest specifically. And so previous to this, it was still seen as an extreme sport, an extreme thing that still very few people relatively would do. I mean, at this point, people had done it, but it was not something that you sort of, try and take your family to. Whereas today it kind of has become that. Yeah.
And technology has really facilitated that. Right. And so the advances in technology, which I think we'll talk a little bit more about later, has made it possible for people who aren't necessarily even that experienced to attempt to do something like this.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I would say today, like a lot of people who end up climbing, not all, maybe a lot's a harsh word. A certain amount of people who end up climbing Mount Everest, either going with none or very little mountain climbing experience. But they happen to be one, the technology is allowing for them to do this, and they also happen to be paying for some very, very, very experienced guides. So it's definitely entered a different phase of, right. At this point, it enters into a different phase of more of an extreme sort of feat of human endurance into more of a, for lack of a better term, an Instagrammable moment.
Right. Yeah, because you don't carry your own stuff either, right? I mean, so that's a big difference.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the technological achievements, just to maybe head us towards a conclusion here. But there's modern weather forecasting, GPS devices, for example, satellite communications. All of these things today have made it so much more achievable and attainable than maybe it once was.
That you can communicate near the peak of Everest, right, with somebody at base camp or even someplace somewhere far away because of satellite technology is astonishing.
Yeah, I mean, you can be up there, you can be heading up there, and somebody can inform you, hey, there's a storm coming. Turn around, come back, or you're not going to make it. That's not something people could rely on, 40 years ago, even, right? So the fact that they can do that now inevitably leads it to being more accessible. And when it becomes more accessible, then a whole host of other issues sort of come with that. And
that's
so
right.
Let's go ahead and jump to sort of our final segment of this episode. And that is sort of some of the environmental issues that sort of come with this hobby, because it might not seem, Hunter, like climbing a mountain is going to be all that environmentally degrading, but boy, it can be.
I can see where it would be, certainly, right?
Yeah. So we talked a lot about the history of mountain climbing, where it's most popular, but this is sort of maybe some of the negative externalities of it. And what we're going to find is, as we hit our final section on Mount Everest specifically, is that mountain serves as an acute sort of reminder of some of the degradations that are occurring. And so we talked a lot about the flora and fauna in our first section. The ecosystems of these areas, because it's already such a harsh environment, are particularly fragile to things like humans paving a trail, or humans leaving stuff around. And so mountain ecosystems, they're just very sensitive in this regard, and this can lead to significant ecological shifts when there's a pattern forming of humans going up and down a mountain. And this applies to Mount Everest, but it applies to all mountains, really. It applies to Mount Hood, where we're at. It applies to Mount Fuji in Japan. It applies to Mount Kilimanjaro. It applies to mountains all around the world. And this, is directly stemmed from sort of where waste and waste management on these mountains is going. And so, popular trails and campsites often become littered with trash and garbage and sort of non-biodegradable waste like plastics. And then high altitude regions really do face difficulties in sort of, where is this waste going? As you're climbing up to Mount Hood, it's not a day journey, right? You're not taking a quick hike up there, 2-hour hike up and a 2-hour hike back. You're going up there, and at certain points you're camping, and you keep going, and eventually you make your way back down, right? And there's a whole area called base camp that is very well known. And so figuring out how to manage this waste and get it out of there efficiently is a challenge. It's a huge challenge.
In an environment where people are just trying to survive in particular, the priority doesn't seem like it lies with, packing in, packing out, right?
Exactly, right? Like, think about the packaging of the materials that we take on sort of our trips these days, right? You go for a hike, right? Just a normal hike, but what you're probably going to bring is, a Cliff Bar, maybe some trail mix. And those both come encased in plastic. And so there's probably variations of that, right? Probably some sort of protein bars, everything, but it's all going to be plastic. And then figuring out where you're disposing of that plastic wrapper, as you suggested, Hunter, becomes less of a priority when there are so many other extreme, things that you have to deal with.
Well, and I don't know if you meant to talk about this in the next section, but the oxygen canisters, right? It's kind of it's a notorious situation now where people are using this supplemental oxygen so that they can survive at these higher altitudes. And, the stories we hear is that they've littered the place with these things. And,
totally.
People, there are some efforts to try to rectify that, but this industry has not necessarily been great at leaving no trace.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's more to say on that, but we're kind of running out of time here. But I just kind of want to make a point of just saying that climbing mountains as a hobby has led to some pretty dramatic changes to some of the ecologies around some of these mountains. And we're going to talk more specifically about Mount Everest in our next section. So let's go ahead, and I guess we'll just go ahead and jump to our final ad break here.
And we'll come back in just a moment.
And we are back. We're going to finish up our episode here talking about Mount Everest more specifically. We've talked a lot about the Himalayas. We talked about mountain climbing as a global hobby. Those two things sort of careen together to create sort of our final section, which is, why does seemingly everyone want to climb Mount Everest? And so let's first talk about the name a little bit, because we already talked a little bit about place names. Hunter, do you know who George Everest is?
I'm guessing, I don't know, but I could take an educated guess based on the topic that we're exploring.
Let's hear it. Yeah, let's do it.
This is somebody who, this is where this must be the George that they named the mountain for, but I don't know who that is.
That very true. Yep. So Mount Everest is named for George Everest. So George Everest was a British Surveyor General of India from 1830 to 1843. And that's basically exactly what his job was. He was charged with surveying India, which at the time was a British colony, to ensure that Britain could maximize its exploitation. Right. So he went all around India, or maybe not him specifically, but sent other surveyors out to basically see what was out there. What could Britain use to exploit, and sort of what could they do with the land and everything like that. And so eventually Mount Everest would be named after him because he was the British Surveyor General. So he, basically told England what was there. But despite being named after him, apparently he actually never saw the mountain himself. So again,
comes up a lot in history, it feels
unfortunately not very surprising. There's a long history of mountains and rivers and a lot of different places being named for people who are not in any way associated with the place. So that's kind of a long-lasting sort of mark of colonialism.
America would be a great example, right?
America, exactly. That's a great example. Named for was it Americo Vespucci or something like that?
Yeah, the map maker put this name on the map, and then subsequently thought, well, maybe I don't want to put this person on the map, but because that was already there, it just took off from there. And so that's the power of cartography as a colonial tool. Basically, is that these names. A lot of power is wrapped up in these names.
Yeah. So, similar to Amerigo Vespucci, according to reports, George Everest was apparently pretty reluctant to have the peak named after him. It was the Royal Geographical Society in England that would decide to name it Everest in 1865. George Everest would die in 1866. Apparently, he didn't really care. I don't know how much protest he actually put into it, but apparently it wasn't really on high on his list for something he actually wanted. But that's not usually how things get named anyways. Usually it's somebody else naming it after somebody else. So the local name in Tibetan is, and again, I tried to pronounce this correctly, but is Chomolungma, which means essentially goddess mother of the world. Nepal coincidentally coined a name for the peak as well in the 1960s as Sagarmatha. And so there's a few different names that are maybe a little bit more place-based for their respective populations. So let's talk a little bit about Mount Everest and sort of, why everybody wants to climb it. So Mount Everest is, based on most sort of definitions, and again, come back to our bonus episode if you want to hear maybe about some of these other definitions, but by most definition is the world's highest peak, standing at 8,848 meters or 29,029 feet. And I would argue that at any point that anything becomes the most of anything, people kind of want to do it or conquer it or whatever, have it, something that sort of status.
There's a famous quote about this. I'm sure you've heard this before. And this was George Mallory, who's an English climber who tried several times to climb Everest and died in an attempt in 1924. And apparently he was asked, why are you doing this? And the response was, because it's there.
Exactly.
Right. So it's, the fame or the self-fulfillment involved in doing something that's extreme. And the most extreme that somebody can find in the case of mountain climbing is to climb this particular peak.
Exactly. Right. I mean, and, Mount Everest specifically, it has kind of become the symbol of the ultimate challenge in the mountaineering world. Now, of course, if you actually talk to some skilled mountaineers, they will actually say that Mount Everest is not one of the most challenging mountains. Some others are. In fact, I think I've heard K2, which is sort of a nearby neighbor, is actually far more challenging to climb. That said, it's become that symbol, and therefore it becomes sort of, certainly within pop culture, the idea that, oh, I need to go do that because of whatever reason you might have. But, in terms of sort of the local cultures, there's some cultural significance here as well. So we already talked about the Tibetan meaning, right? It's called goddess mother of the world. And this sort of tracks, through a wide range of different cultures, including one that we're going to talk pretty extensively about, which is the Sherpa. And so we're going to come back and sort of talk about them, because the Sherpa, while I think maybe is more commonly known as sort of the guides that people hire to bring them up to the top of mountains, including Mount Everest. It's not a profession; it's a people, and so we want to make that
ethnic group. Yeah,
an ethnic group. Yeah, I really want to drive that point home, because I feel like they get unduly minimalized a lot inside these stories. Just to continue on, we've talked a lot about sort of the commercial expeditions, and one of as these things happen, as these commercial expeditions happen, and more people climb it, such as Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay, these tales of triumph, really draw a lot of people. But then weirdly, the tales of the tragedies also have featured prominently in
that's
a
an
lot.
Important point. Yeah, I think that's definitely what's going on. I think John Krakauer famously wrote Into Thin Air, right? And it was chronicling a particular ascent that resulted in the death of several climbers, including several, or at least one extremely experienced guide from New Zealand, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And then a movie was made about it. And so it's these disasters that also sort of heightens the attention as well.
Exactly. Well, and one very famous sort of example of this that's become sort of world renowned is green boots. Have you heard about green boots?
I have not heard of that.
So green boots is it was the name given to an unidentified body of a climber that became a landmark on Everest. As people would climb up, you could see the green boots. And apparently it was on the Northeast Ridge route. Even to this day, the body has not officially been identified, although it has been moved. Eventually, some climbers went up there not that long ago. I want to say back in like 2013 or something. Some climbers went up there and moved the body a little bit just so it was less visible, basically to give a little bit more peace to the resting place.
I mean, that's an incredible thing that there are. If you're ascending this mountain, that you will go by the frozen corpses of people who didn't make it. And that's that's, I mean, chilling, right? That is really strange.
It's very chilling. And that's not even trying to make a pun there, because it's just
it's
very,
just straight up like,
yeah.
wow.
So apparently, one theory of who this person was an Indian climber named Sewang Paljor, because he was wearing some similar things and ultimately did end up getting lost on the mountain as he attempted to summit it in 1996. There's some other theories about who it is. Regardless, the rise to prominence of green boots, whether it was Sewang Paljor or somebody else, and the tragedy behind it, and sort of this idea of a corpse becoming a landmark, kind of further fueled this idea of people wanting to go up the mountain. In fact, green boots has been sort of featured in sort of many different sort of pop culture sort of piece of work, whether, a documentary talking about it or, sort of a call out to him. And so, this is all sort of, the triumphs, as people climb in sort of, in the beginning sort of propelled it, climbing the mountain to great heights, sort of started that off. I would say now it's more of the tragedy stories that sort of have continued to keep it sort of within sort of the pop culture sphere. And now we get into a point where social media has become sort of the dominant reason for people to maybe travel to Mount Everest in order to get that sort of, again, that Instagrammable moment. There's more to say on this topic, but there's a lot more I want to say overall. And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the economic impact of Everest tourism, because while we talked a lot about the hobby, we could talk a little bit about some of these stories about climbing and why people want to climb it. The economic impact really means quite a lot to a country like Nepal. And so Everest tourism is a major source of revenue for Nepal, with climbing permits really fetching substantial fees. So Nepal itself, the country, this does not include local fees, which can vary depending on where you're staying. Nepal charges $11,000 US for a permit to climb the mountain. So just to go there, get your permit that allows you to go up to base camp and go up is going to cost you $11,000. Obviously, your hotel, your food, your flights in, everything else that's not included inside that $11,000.
The guide, everything. Yeah.
All told, the average cost, and I don't know, I didn't have a date that was attached to this average. I believe the article I read was from the late teens, but I don't know where they're pulling their information. But all told, this average cost to climb is ranging around $50,000 per person, but can go significantly higher depending on amenities, right? So if you have more guides, for example, you're going to pay quite a bit more. And so this has really led to a lot of local growth in a lot of different industries in Nepal, such as lodges, restaurants and eateries and shops that sort of specialize in trekking and camps and sort of, having gear, right? Because if you're flying there from the United States or Canada or, wherever, China, you're probably not going to fly with all of your own gear. You're probably going to end up buying gear there and then end up leaving it behind just because there's so much you have to bring. And then there's this ethnic group called the Sherpas that factor heavily into all of what we've been talking about. And so this is kind of where I want to talk a little bit more about the Sherpas and give them a little bit of time to their own. So Sherpas have often been sort of categorized as the guides, the rescuers, for example, of people who are climbing Mount Everest. And I wanted to bring them into this episode, one, to give them their due, but also to maybe try and separate them from the popular culture, which sort of sees them as, well, Sherpa is a profession, right? That's kind of the way it's sort of perceived as. You watch something, somebody goes and hires a Sherpa. They're not hiring a Sherpa. They're hiring somebody who is Sherpa to serve as their guide.
Right. And I mean, this also points to this whole tourism industry has kind of forced a lot of individuals to, there's a lot of money that can be made, but at a very high risk as well. And so
Exactly.
it's a tense situation because, people need money to support their families and this kind of things, but at what cost?
Exactly.
And that's the issue.
Exactly. And so Sherpas, they're an ethnic group of people, generally from the mountainous region of Nepal, particularly that area around Mount Everest. That's sort of where their historic home has been. They originally migrated to this region from Tibet somewhere in the 1500s. And they speak Sherpa, which is a language of the Tibeto-Burman family. And they sort of have all their own cultural sort of identities and the traditions, and they have their own festivals. Some of the popular ones here I have in my notes would be the Dumji and the Mani Rimdu. And they are predominantly Buddhist, right? These are people who have sort of been steeped in sort of the mountain Buddhist culture in a similar vein as the Tibetan monasteries. And so this would be a little bit different from the Buddhist monasteries that would be more in the lowlands of India. They have a little bit of a different aesthetic to them and a different practice. But traditionally, Sherpas are not guides for people to go up the mountain. Traditionally, they are farmers, herders, and then they trade with other people nearby. But they have been known exceptionally for their mountaineering skills, just due to the fact that as a society, as a culture that was sort of moved into the mountainous regions in sort of that 1500s era, that's hundreds of years ago, they've sort of naturally developed pretty exceptional mountaineering skills. And so this has led to many of them working as sort of guides and trek guides within the Himalaya mountains specifically. And so that's sort of where we get this idea of them being just a profession. And so just, to call out some significant roles that they've partaken in sort of mountaineering. So we talked about Tenzing Norgay. And so he was Sherpa, and he helped Edmund Hillary, probably did a lot of the work, for being really honest, to get Edmund Hillary up to the top of the mountain and ensure that he survived and was able to come back down. And so as we sort of, I don't want to, move us along too fast, but we're sort of running out of time here. But I wanted to give Sherpas this due and sort of help break them out of the mold a little bit of just being associated with climbing on Mount Everest. So generally, today, Sherpas aren't treated super well inside this industry. And so there's a lot of advocacy within Nepal, and I would say within mountaineering as a hobby in general, that if you're going to do this, that there's a lot of advocacy around them getting better wages, rights, and then just recognition within the mountaineering industry as a whole for being seen as more than just the people who are going to haul up a lot of your equipment and make sure that you go up and come back down. And so that's a big issue that they're contending with. And unfortunately, I think they have a long way to go, because pop culture still sort of perceives them as just a profession.
Well, let me ask you this question at this time. Have you heard or seen a documentary called 14 Peaks, Nothing is Impossible?
I've heard about it, but I haven't seen it.
Because this is a film that chronicles a Nepalese man who moved to Britain and served in the British Army, but born in Nepal, and led a team of, I think, 9 Nepalese climbers to climb the 14 8,000er peaks in a record time of 7 months. So in the past, it took 7 years for somebody to do this, and they've got some funding, and this was an all Nepalese climbing team. And this documentary chronicles this situation. And part of, what was behind doing this was to bring attention to Nepalese climbers, Sherpas included, and to sort of articulate, the important role of local people in this, instead of people coming from, New Zealand, Australia, United States, Britain, France, wherever they're coming from. So it's a documentary from 2021, and the leader of it was Nirmal Purja, and who goes by Neems.
Mm-hmm.
And this is somebody with an incredible constitution, the leader of this particular endeavor. And, in the film, they, on their first ascent, they're immediately enlisted into helping other people. Right. And so even in the context of doing all this stuff, and anyways, I'm throwing that out there because it's a different take on how we think about, or how we, mountaineering on Everest and some of the larger mountains. So it might be worth checking out for listeners. I
mean, I think that ties right into what sort of we were talking about, which was, almost restoring the identity. I feel like the identity of the Himalayan mountains and Mount Everest specifically has been so tied to very prominent European, American, Australian, what have you, climbers. And they're not really associated with the people themselves, aside from as being sort of the helpers, aside from being somebody to go up and, ensure that you're able to come back. And so this seems like a fantastic documentary that I definitely want to check out, because I think to what he was trying to do was try to restore some of that identity, that these mountains are in Nepal, and we are Nepalese people, and therefore, we can do this too, and we should have some notoriety with respects to these mountains.
One other thing I'll mention, because I think it's important. There's a very famous picture of a line of people waiting to summit Everest, and it looks like there's dozens, maybe over 100 people waiting in line at near the top of the mountain to get to the top. And this was a picture that Nirmal Purja took during this, the filming of this, the ascent of these things. And so, the other thing he and his team were trying to bring attention to was the cultural politics of all these people being up there, and how dangerous it is for all these people to be there. And I remember seeing that picture and just being very impressed by how strange it was that there were all these people just waiting in line to get up in this extremely remote place.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen the exact picture you're talking about. It almost makes it feel like this is a Disneyland ride, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, there's something incongruent about a line of people waiting at what sometimes is called the top of the world, to get to the top to take pictures. And of course, I don't want to belittle the efforts of anybody involved in this, but it's striking to see that this is what this has become.
Exactly, yeah. And so I think, just to close us out here, because we're a little bit over time, the Mount Everest sort of has, serves as sort of a dual face a little bit for Nepal. We talked a little bit about the economics of it. Obviously this is providing a revenue source for them. And that's not, Nepal isn't sort of unique in that manner. A lot of countries rely on tourism, for large parts of their budgets. However, that also provides a lot of challenges for locals who, one, now maybe their costs of living are going up because there's, wealthy people flying in here and, buying up a lot of the supplies, XYZ. And then it also has this impact of sort of maybe minimalizing sort of the local cultures and sort of the societies there. And so I think Mount Everest, as we were just talking about that line and sort of the amount of people who are trying to go up there and the accessibility of it now, especially in this world where everything is defined by, sort of these Instagrammable moments, it's really adds maybe like an inflection point of, what's it going to look like in 10 years? Because, or maybe 20 years, because 20 years ago, there wasn't a line to get up to Mount Everest. There was people doing it, but it was still a lot harder.
Even with the small number of people, like if you read Into Thin Air, which I think is in a book written in the 90s about efforts that were made in the 90s, there's, it doesn't take a lot of people to create a bottleneck in a situation.
That's
like
true.
That.
Yeah. There's actually similar, not to pivot over to Mount Hood, but there's sometimes there are a lot of people climbing Mount Hood here in Oregon, and there can be a similar bottleneck situation. And I think that goes back to sort of maybe the delicacy of some of these mountains as you get towards the top. There's not a lot of options for where you're going to go. And you start to see that on basically every mountain. Yeah.
Yeah. And people, I think the guides who've been paid tens of thousands of dollars, at least this is the way it's been depicted in some media and movies and books and articles, that, there maybe that's weighing in on how they make their decisions about whether they should push on or not. And maybe in situations that are less than ideal, they think, well, let's just go for it because, we've got to make it this time. And that's
right.
dangerous.
Sunk cost, right?
Yeah.
You're already putting all this money. You're going to get to the top.
Right.
And that inevitably leads to issues, right?
Right. And it's led to death in certain situations. Right.
Well, I mean, if going back to green boots, just to close out here, if it was this Sewang Paljor, it was a very similar situation, right? They got pretty close to the top. A storm was blowing in, but they decided they would be up there in something like 30 minutes or something like that. They could go up there, be there for a minute or two and then head back down. And that amount of time wouldn't matter all that much. And as it turns out, that amount of time actually at that high of altitude matters a whole lot. So
yeah, it does.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I hate to end us on a little bit of a tragic note as we're talking about Mount Everest, but
that's really what's at stake, though. I mean, yeah,
totally, yeah. But you want to run through some pluggables?
Sure. I'm Hunter Shobi. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University. I'm co-author of Portlandness, a Cultural Atlas, and Upper Left Cities, a Cultural Atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle. Those are written with David Banas, and I'm co-host of this podcast.
Yeah, and my name is Geoff Gibson, co-host of this podcast, Geography is Everything. You can also find me over on YouTube. That's youtube.com/Geography by Geoff. I would love to see you over there. And of course, I would love to, if people came from over there, came over and listened over here, but that's sort of a different side of this plug. If you liked what you heard today, you really found everything was enjoyable, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or whatever app you might use to listen to podcasts. It all helps us, and I love seeing those. If you want more geography from us, you can go over to our Substack page. It's geographyiseverything.substack.com, and you can subscribe for free and get access to a little bit of extra geography each week, or you can subscribe with a little bit of money each month and get even more geography, including some ad-free podcasts that you can get over there, so you don't have to listen to all those pesky ads that might come your way. Otherwise, I think next time we're going to tackle the wonderful world of IKEA. That's that lack.
Speaking of waiting in lines, yeah,
that lack end table that you have, or you had at one point, maybe when you were 18 or 19, because they were just so darn cheap. We're going to talk all about that. So come back next week, and we'll see you then.
Thank you for listening.